Okay, good evening everybody. I am very glad to welcome you today on behalf of the University of Bonn to the opening and the first lecture in the context of the lecture series on a renewable future. My name is Sandra Gilgan, and my colleagues Una Kliemann and Miriam Schmidt, whom you know from the registration, and I will be your contact persons in the unit for European and International Networks, which is part of the Department of International Affairs of the University of Bonn. Now, this lecture series is jointly organized by our coordination unit, Sustainable Development and International Cooperation, and the unit of the University of Bonn, and the International Renewable Energy Agency, IRENA. The coordination unit, Sustainable Development in International Cooperation, was originally funded by the Ministry of Innovation, Science and Research of the state of North Rhine-Westphalia, which is now the Ministry of Culture and Science. There has been a name change. We are still in line with the work of this coordination unit, and so our goals are to foster networks with stakeholders from Bonn and North Rhine-Westphalia in the field of sustainable development, to promote the topic of sustainable development and teaching and research, and to strengthen activities in the field of sustainable development at the University of Bonn. So IRENA, as an intergovernmental organization that supports countries in their transition to a sustainable energy future, actually is a strong partner for us in this work. Tonight, for this lecture series, I would like to welcome Dr. Dolf Gielen, who is sitting in front, Director of the IRENA Innovation and Technology Center in Bonn. Thank you very much for being here. And Mr. Luis Janeiro, who is also one of our lecturers for tonight. We would also like to thank the whole team from IRENA for the cooperation, the support in organizing this lecture series, and for sharing the knowledge and expertise in the lecture series. A warm welcome also for you, for our audience, of course. We're delighted to see that the lecture series has met such broad interest, and we sincerely hope that you will have a fruitful and instructive time here with us. Now, for the first lecture, I would like to welcome Dr. Gielen on stage. Dr. Gielen is the director of the IRENA Innovation and Technology Center in Bonn since 2011. And as such, he oversees the agency's work on advising member countries in the area of technology status and roadmaps, energy planning, costs and markets, and innovation policy frameworks. Thank you very much for being here tonight. The floor is yours, and I will simply set up your presentation. This is
Thank you very much, Ms. Gilgan. Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for joining. This is the first lecture out of a series of 7 lectures. They will run till end of January. Topic of today is accelerating the global energy transition. We will have another 6 lectures on topics that very much reflect the questions, the key questions we receive from countries in the area of renewable energy deployment. So we will be looking at the integration of variable renewables, end of October, planning transformation of power systems. We will have a deep dive on island energy transitions on the 9th of November. Bioenergy, and especially sustainable bioenergy, an important theme, so November 23rd. We will look deeper into innovation on December 7th, energy access with renewables on December 21st, and then in the new year, the cost of various renewable technologies and cost reduction potentials, end of January. The context within which we are looking at renewables is that there is a global agreement to limit climate change well below 2 degrees. And to do that, you need to find solutions for carbon emissions in energy supply and demand. So you need an energy transition. And renewable energy can play a key role in that energy transition. So we have seen significant progress in recent years, and we'll come to that point, but much more is needed in the coming years and the coming decades. And there is a role for the governments in that, and there's a role for the private sector in making that happen. The rate at which this energy transition can happen depends on availability of technologies. It depends on the economics, cost of energy transition, and it depends on enabling frameworks, so policies and regulations. And these are some of the aspects we will touch upon today. So, but before moving there, let me say a few words about IRENA. So it's an acronym for International Renewable Energy Agency. The agency was established in 2011. And in fact, there was a process before that, and Germany played a key role in establishing IRENA. The headquarters of IRENA are in United Arab Emirates, the city of Abu Dhabi. But we have an innovation and technology center that is located here in Bonn, in the premises of the Ministry of Environment and Buildings. And we have about 55 staff here in Bonn. The agency has grown. Initially, in 2011, there were 65 members, but that has grown now to 152 members. And that's 151 countries and the European Union. And there's another 28 states in accession, plus a number of countries that have expressed interest also to become members. So we hope that in a couple of years we will have global membership. And if you compare that to other international organizations, that is a very rapid build-up of membership. So it shows that there is international strong interest to deploy renewable energy. The mandate of IRENA is to accelerate sustainable renewable energy deployment. And when we talk about renewable energy, we mean bioenergy, geothermal, hydropower, marine energies, wind and solar. So 6 types of renewable energy are included. And in order to accelerate renewables, we have activities in a number of areas. So we work on data for renewable energy. So we have renewable energy statistics. We do work on the resource potentials. So we collect resource maps and make these available. We also work on the cost of renewable energy technologies. So all these are activities around knowledge, building knowledge. We advise countries on how to apply renewables. So, for example, we get a lot of questions around the issue of integration of variable renewables. There is discussions in the countries how much variable renewables can you integrate into today's grids, or what types of investments do you need if you want to increase the share of renewables further. So we do computer model analysis and technical analysis on these aspects. We also get questions around the enabling framework. So what type of policies are best suited if you want to develop renewables? Should you introduce feed-in tariffs, or should you introduce the auction systems? So we also advise in these areas. And also we work on various aspects of capacity building. So to help the countries so they have the experts in-house to further deploy renewables. For example, in the area of project development of bankable project proposals. So that is the second area of technical assistance. We also work as an advocacy, if you like, for renewables. So to make sure that the international debate on energy is based on the latest information for renewable energy. We are in the process of developing a new work program for the coming 2 years, and a new element we will add is around energy transition and energy transformation. So energy transition, I would say the German equivalent is Energiewende. Energy transformation, what we mean by that is the characterization of the end point where you want to go. So, for example, there's a lot of countries that now talk about decarbonization by 2050, and the question so is then, okay, if that is your transformation, what you're aiming for, what is then the transition path, how to get there? So let me ask a question to the audience. How many of you have a technical background? Okay, about half. Let me start to explain a little bit about the global energy in general before moving into renewables. So what you see on this slide is 4 pie charts, and let's start from the 2 pie charts on the left side. So they show the primary energy supply, the worldwide primary energy supply in the year 2014. The leftmost pie chart shows the shares in primary energy supply of different types of energy. So in the brownish area, that is coal, you see that coal had a share of about 29% in primary energy supply. The dark blue area, that is oil, so 31%. And the light blue area, that is natural gas, about 21%. So more than 3/4 of primary energy supply is fossil fuels. And then you see a small area for nuclear, the yellow area, it's about 5%. And then the remainder, 14.2%, that is renewables. So you see a big green area, biofuels, so that is about 10%. And you see smaller areas for hydro and a category other. That includes then solar and wind. Total primary energy supply worldwide is 574 exajoule. And an exajoule is 10 to the order of 18 joules. The second pie chart shows the energy supply split by region. So you see a big share for the OECD countries, about 38%, and you see a big share of China with 22%. So that may come a bit as a surprise. You see that the bulk of the energy is produced in the regions where it is consumed. So there is significant trade of oil, but for coal and for natural gas, there is not so much trade in the big global picture. And then if you move to the right side of this slide, so you see two pie charts of final consumption. Now what we mean by that is, especially for electricity, there are significant losses in converting the primary fuels into electricity. So a typical efficiency of a coal-fired power plant is around 40%, oil a little bit higher. A modern gas-fired power plant may achieve 65% conversion efficiency. But so there are significant losses in that process. For the world as a whole, around 130 exajoule is lost by converting these primary fuels into electricity. So that is the majority of the difference between the primary energy supply of 574 exajoule and the final energy consumption, which is nearly 400 exajoule. So if you look how final energy is consumed, so if you look at the third pie chart, there is an area in red, which is electricity, and electricity constituted around 18% of final energy use in 2014. Now, why does that number matter? A lot of the discussions about renewables very quickly become discussions about renewable electricity. And what you see from this pie chart is that you can never solve the energy problem, you can never have a complete energy transition if you only focus on electricity. So it's very important to also consider other types of final energy use in building sector, in industry, and in transport, if you really want an energy transformation. And in terms of shares of final energy use, so there are these three sectors, buildings, transport, and industry, and each of them roughly accounts for a third of final energy use. So, which also means you need to look at all three sectors if you want a global energy transition. The focusing in on renewables in final energy use. So what this graph shows is a breakdown of how that renewable energy is used. So today there's a renewable energy use, final renewable energy use of about 65 exajoule. And what you see at the bottom of these bars is two green areas. And these two green areas, that is biomass. So dark green is traditional biomass, so that is the use of biomass in developing countries for cooking largely. And then in light green you see modern bioenergy uses for example, a pulp mill that uses residues of paper making for energy purposes. So bioenergy accounts for about 3/4 of total renewable energy use today. Again, that may come as a surprise because the bulk of the discussion is focused on wind and solar energy. But in fact, for quite some time to come, bioenergy will be the dominant form of renewable energy. In dark blue you see hydro, so hydro has also a significant contribution in the overall share. And then at the top you see solar, you see also wind. The share of renewables in final energy use has been growing. So in 1990, that is the leftmost bar, was 16.6%. In 2015, that's the rightmost bar, it was 18.8%. The average growth over the last 5 years was nearly 0.2 percentage points per year. So that is a positive development, but it's a relatively slow growth. We want to see much more growth, and we need much more growth if we want to solve the climate problems. That growth of renewables is complemented by gains in energy efficiency. So, the typical unit that is used to measure that worldwide is energy intensity, so the amount of energy that is used per unit of gross domestic product. And that energy intensity has been improving over time continuously, and there has been an uptick in that improvement. So for a period of 20 years, between 1990 and 2010, the improvement of global energy intensity was around 1.3% per year. But in the period from 2010, it has been accelerating. And at the moment, it's about 1.8% per year improvement. So if you have a global economic growth of 1.8% and you have an intensity improvement of 1.8%, then your energy demand is roughly flat. Now, let's look more closely at the power sector and what we've seen in trends there. So the bars here show the additions. So here 2001, there was about 15, 16 gigawatts of renewable power generation capacity added in that year. The rightmost bar, that is 2016, and there was 161 gigawatts added that year. So the capacity additions grew tenfold over that period. And you see that in 2001, it's mainly a dark blue area, so hydropower that was added, and a light blue area, wind. And you see that while hydropower additions have grown somewhat over that period to more than 20 gigawatts per year, the bulk of the growth has been in the light blue area, wind, and here this yellow area, which is solar. So 2 new types of renewable energy have been added over that period and have emerged as as key generation options. The green line here shows the share of renewables in total power generation capacity additions. And so that's on this axis. And so from 2012, more than half of the global power generation capacity additions were renewable. So this is not a niche technology anymore. This is mainstream now. And it continues to grow very rapidly. So today we have around 300 gigawatts of solar PV, around 500 gigawatts of wind power generation capacity installed worldwide, and around 1,100, 1,200 gigawatts of hydro power generation capacity. The total share of renewables in power generation is about a quarter. And that share has been growing in recent years by about 0.7 percentage points per year. So the power generation sector is clearly the success story for renewables. That's where we've seen most progress. But as said, power sector alone is not enough. We would like to see similar graphs for buildings, for industry, and for transport. So, what I've shown you so far is statistical data, recent trends. And now let's look at the forward-looking part. What do we need and what do we think is possible? We do a lot of forward-looking work, roadmaps for energy transition for individual countries in a program which we call REMAP, Renewable Energy Roadmaps. We have been doing that for some years now, and at the moment we're working with about 70 countries covering about 90% of global energy use. So based on this analysis, we can say things about what do we see as global trends and global potentials. And Germany has the G20 presidency this year. And as part of that presidency, they wanted to look much more closely at what are the energy sector consequences of the Paris Climate Agreement. So they asked us, IRENA, and the International Energy Agency to explore that further. And both agencies have done separate analysis, but came to very similar conclusions that I'll present in a minute. The results, the findings, were used to inform the G20, and that has resulted in a G20 Energy and Climate Action Agenda. So G20 has committed to try to implement the findings. And what we found is, first of all, we looked at what is the remaining carbon budget if we want to stay well below 2 degrees. And the first question was, well, what is well below 2 degrees? So we defined that as a chance of 2 out of 3 to stay below 2 degrees. And the IPCC has done analysis of what does that mean for carbon budgets. And then we calculated what would that now mean for the energy carbon budget. And our conclusion was that there is a remaining budget of 790 gigatons of CO2. In comparison, the world emitted in 2015 32 gigatons of CO2. So if you would remain at today's emission level, you would have slightly over 20 years of emission left. But clearly you cannot stay at today's level and then suddenly drop to zero. So you need to be on a very rapid emission reduction path between now and 2060. Basically, by 2060, you need to be at zero emissions. Zero emissions from energy supply and zero emissions from energy consumption. And that is not a single sector. We're not only talking power sector, but also the end-use sectors. And it's not a single country. You need that as a global effort. At the same time, the global economy is projected to grow 2.5, threefold between now and 2050. So if you need to reduce emissions by about 70% till 2050, to be on that path to zero by 2060, and the economy grows threefold, that means you need a 9-fold reduction of the carbon intensity of economic activity, of GDP. And so we looked at how can you achieve that. So first of all, in the baseline, so that is the top of this graph, you see a slight increase of energy emissions from 32 gigatons to slightly over 40 gigatons by 2050. So already in the base case, reference case, policies in place, there is a significant decoupling of economic activity and CO2 emissions. So there is already important energy efficiency gains. I showed you the past trends. There is already a growth of renewables to about 23, 24%. But we need much more. And so how to close that gap? You see a green area here, which is renewables, which accounts for nearly half. You see a purple area, which is electrification of end users with more renewable power. For example, electric vehicles in combination with more renewable electricity generation. You see more energy efficiency, 29%. And finally, here you see a yellow area in top, which is the contribution of CO2 capture and storage and nuclear. So about 90% of the effort is through renewable energy and energy efficiency. The IEA had slightly different numbers. They had about 70% from renewables and energy efficiency, but also they came to the conclusion that it's really these two options that constitute the bulk of what is needed for the next 35 years. And what does that mean for the energy supply? So today, here is about 16% of primary energy is renewables. About 84% is fossil fuels. That would, in the reference case, change a little bit. You would go to 76% fossil fuels and 24% renewables. But what we really need is this bar, which has 35% fossil fuels, 65% renewables by 2050. And so if you want to grow from 16% to 65%, you need a growth of well above 1% per year. And I just showed you that what we've seen in the last couple of years is about 0.2% per year. So you need a significant acceleration of renewables growth to make this scenario happen. And at the same time, we need to increase energy efficiency gains. So we've seen 1.8% intensity improvements in recent years. We need 2.5% intensity improvements. Now, if you look at what that means by sector, the overall, we need a 70% reduction compared to reference case in 2050. Power sector needs most emissions reductions, 85%, but also the end-use sectors, industry, transport, and buildings need a reduction somewhere between 56% and 73%. And so that is what we call energy transformation, and that will have important implications for fossil fuels. What this graph shows is here the diamond is today's consumption of fossil fuels, so about 150 exajoules of coal are consumed. You see about 100, slightly over 100 exajoules of gas, and about 140 exajoules of oil. The top of these graphs, of these bars, is where we would be in the reference case, policies in place. So all coal would be at today's level, but gas and oil would see a significant growth. The colored part here shows where we would be if this scenario, if this remap scenario were implemented. So a significant reduction of the outlook, but even a significant reduction compared to today's level for coal. For oil, gas demand would be roughly slightly below today's level. So gas would become the most important form of fossil fuels, but still it's not a great business to be in if this scenario comes true. And so related to this, there is a lot of discussion on, okay, what is now the future of these fossil fuel companies? And what should we do with all these fossil fuels? So we have 10 times more fossil fuels in the ground than we can produce. And the big question is, how do you keep these fossil fuels in the ground? And that's what will be discussed here in Bonn in next month then at the COP. Renewables growth, we need about 1.2% per year in final energy terms, which is a seven-fold increase. So you can look in primary energy terms, you can look in final energy terms. The numbers are slightly different, but the trends are I would say, clear. What this graph shows is how renewables would be used. First in the 2030, in this remap scenario, so 145 exajoules compared to 65 today. In 2050, here, the right bar, 235 exajoules of renewables. The orange area is the contribution of the power sector, so about 45% of total renewables use. And the yellow area is the heat applications, the blue area is transport sector applications. So end-use sector applications really dominate. Power sector, today we have about 6,500 gigawatts of power generation capacity worldwide. In comparison, a typical coal-fired power plant is somewhere between half a gigawatt and a gigawatt. These power plants, so here is the 6,000 reference case. There would be a growth to about 12,000 gigawatts. And then you see two bars for the remap, and you see that total capacity would in fact be 20,000 gigawatts by 2050. So more than a threefold increase from today's level with the remap scenario. Why so much faster growth in the remap scenario? There's two reasons. First of all, and foremost, is there is a lot of variable renewables in that scenario, and you need natural gas power plants to back them up to ensure that there is availability of power generation at all times. And second, there is also electrification, so more electricity use for electric vehicles, heat pumps, etc. But overall electricity demand would even slightly decline. So reference case, a growth from around 24,000 terawatt hours to about 47,000 terawatt hours, so a doubling. Slightly less electricity demand in the remap. And if you look at the contribution of renewables, so in terawatt hour terms, about 80% of the generation would be from renewables. In capacity terms, about 70% of the capacity would be renewable. Investment needs for this scenario, additional investments around 29 trillion US dollars. In comparison, today's GDP is, depending how you express it, somewhere between 70 and 110 trillion US dollars. The additional investment needs are especially in the end-use sectors. So that is the building sector, transport and industry. There are some additional investments in power generation, but to some extent these are offset by reduced investments in fossil power generation. There are significantly reduced investments in production of fossil fuels. So net of these three bars is about $29 trillion. Which is affordable. It's about 0.4% of GDP. Why, now the big rationale, why would you do a policy that costs additional money? If you look at benefits, there are two major benefits that are today ignored in the markets. So one is health benefits. So there was yesterday a report issued for Europe. Europe, every year, 400,000 people die because of air pollution. And energy supply and demand is a major cause of that air pollution. And in other parts of the world, China, India, the effects are significantly larger. So by changing energy patterns, you can reduce that air pollution and you can reduce these health impacts. So now you can try to express that in money terms, but then the question always is, what is the value of a life? There are certain methods to do that. We've applied one such method, and the orange area is evaluation of these benefits. On top of that, in blue, you have the climate benefits. But if you compare the additional costs, So less than 2 trillion per year. If you compare that to the benefits, somewhere between 4 and 10 trillion per year. So the benefits exceed the costs by a factor of 2 to 6. So, and that is a very strong policy rationale why you should introduce these type of policies. There is a significant discussion in the climate community around what is called stranded assets. So we need a crash program to deal with climate emissions, with CO2 emissions. And as said, that means that some of the oil, gas and coal needs to stay in the ground. That may also mean that some of the, say, coal-fired power plants need to be closed before the end of their technical life. And that type of effects, so a coal plant which you need to close while it would be technically still quite up to standard, that is called a stranded asset. And we tried to quantify these stranded assets. We found around 10 trillion for the REMAP case. The bulk of the stranded assets is buildings that need replacement because their energy efficiency is not up to standard, and retrofitting them is more expensive than just demolishing them and building new. And you see upstream. So this is the fossil fuels that need to stay in the ground. We also analyzed the scenario, suppose you don't act now. You act 10 years later. But then you need to act much faster. Consequence is much higher stranded assets. So if you act 10 years later, your stranded assets double. You have 20 trillion in stranded assets. So if you compare these numbers with the investment needs, it's quite substantial. So you need to consider also this effect. But still, overall policy makes sense. Now, from a macroeconomic perspective, we also looked at GDP impacts. We found that this REMAP scenario results in a positive impact on GDP. Reason being that if you invest in renewables and in energy efficiency, you front load your economic activity. So especially you have upfront investments, but you have no operating cost. If you invest in a coal plant or in a gas plant, and you have relatively low upfront investment cost, but you have operating cost all over the lifespan of the project. So you front load your investments, and as a consequence there is more economic activity upfront, plus because you have more economic activity, you have also longer term more growth. So the 0.4%, which I showed earlier because of the additional investment needs, doubles because of this multiplier effect. And you have an overall GDP impact of 0.8%. And a second aspect of macroeconomics that is very important to policymakers is the impact on jobs. So there would be a positive impact. What you see here, 2050 reference case jobs. So below 50 million. The rightmost bar, REMAP 2050, well above 50 million jobs. So there is a slight positive job effect by moving from reference case to this more sustainable scenario. So that's the global picture, and now I hand over to Luis Janeiro for the European analysis.
Thanks, Dolf. So indeed I will tell you a bit how this global transition translates into the European situation. I will structure the talk in 3 parts. First, I will explain you how we consume energy today in Europe and what is the role of renewables today in Europe also and how it has evolved in recent years. Then I will touch very briefly on the discussion that is ongoing now in terms of what should be the role of renewables in 2030. And in the third part, we will look at the other side of that question. So not what should be the role of renewables in 2030, but what can be the role of renewables in 2030. So what are the options that we have to accelerate the deployment of renewables in Europe? So starting with a historical graph, this shows the consumption of energy, the whole consumption of energy in Europe since 1990 until 2015. And you see, how is the pointer going here? I think it's probably here, yeah. So you see a clear trend from 1990 until 2006 approximately, in which energy consumption was growing strongly together with very strong growth of the European Union. And then after 2006 and until now, another decline in energy consumption, especially in 2009, right after the financial crisis. Overall, we are now at the same level, more or less, of consumption than in 1990. However, the GDP of the EU has grown by 46%, so we can now produce much more goods and add much more value with the same amount of energy. So Europe is much more productive in terms of the energy use. If you look at, so that's with regards to the historical trend, and if you look at the structure of that consumption, the main three sources of energy for the EU have been solid fuel, so this is basically coal, oil products, and natural gas. So those three dominated the energy system in 1990, and they still do in 2015. They account now for 72% of the total primary energy supply of the EU. Then you have nuclear, the red bar there, that has remained fairly constant over this period. So basically most of the nuclear plants that are there now were there already in the 90s. And the bar on the top, so the blue section on the top is renewable. So you see that there's some increase, but it's still a relatively small share of the total consumption in the EU. So the question is, how do we use that energy in the EU? Already Dolph mentioned before, globally, how does that go? But in Europe, we basically use energy for three end uses. The first one is buildings. We spend 40% of our energy in heating our buildings and keeping the lights on. Approximately two-thirds of that is in residential buildings, and the other third is in commercial buildings. Then the second largest end use of energy is the transport sector. Most of it is for road transport, and then there's another relatively large chunk that goes to aviation, and then the rest of the consumptions are much smaller, so domestic navigation, and for instance, rail transport also. And then industry accounts for a quarter of the energy consumption in the EU, and there's 5 sectors, there's 5 here, so food, paper, glass and ceramics for construction, iron and steel and chemical products that account for about 2/3 of the consumption in the industrial sector. If we dive a bit more in this, in each of these sectors, we see in this pie chart you see the share of the different forms of supply for each of these sectors. In buildings, most of the consumption, so this share here, all this area here, is fossil fuels that are directly burned in a building, in a boiler in a building, for instance. And the largest fraction is natural gas, and then we have coal and oil products. Then another large chunk is biomass, 10%. And all this section here in blue is electricity. A fraction of it is already renewable, this part here in blue, and another, the rest of it is still not renewable. And then we have these smaller shares that is district heat. So if we look at the overall pie chart, all of this is heat production in the buildings, and the other third is electricity. So that's more or less how the energy is consumed in buildings in the EU. In industry is a similar picture. Also, roughly 2/3 is heat and 1/3 is electricity. However, in industry, we still use quite some more coal than in buildings. So it has a larger fraction of fossil fuels. And then in transport, there's a clear winner. Oil products still account for 94% of the energy that we consume in transport. And there's some ground being gained by biodiesel and bioethanol. But it's about 4% of the total consumption. And then we also use electricity in transport, particularly in rail. But there's a clear dominant here, which is oil. So that's how we use energy today. And the question is, what is wrong with that way? A lot of it was touched already before by Mr. Hillen, but let's come back to that. So first problem with that is environmentally unsustainable. So burning fossil fuels creates greenhouse gases, and it obviously is a problem from a global warming perspective. But there's also other environmental impacts related to the combustion of fossil fuels. Human health, Dolph just mentioned 400,000 deaths in Europe premature with the combustion of fossil fuels. And then there's also strategic and economic reasons. So security of supply is one. So Europe imports 43% of the energy it uses. And that also has an economic side of it. So we spend 1 billion per day in paying energy imports. So that's quite some money that we could save if we could produce all this energy locally. So this has been recognized by European institutions in the last couple of decades, and is being reflected in European policy. And as it is now, let's say the cornerstone of European legislation to support renewables is the Renewable Energy Directive of 2009. In that directive, it established a 20% target for the EU by 2020, and also a sub-target for the transport sector. So by 2020, 10% of the energy for the transport sector was supposed to be renewable. And the directive also establishes specific targets for each member state, and it mandates member states to adopt policies to reach those targets, to create a national renewable energy action plan, and to then report every couple of years to the European Commission on progress towards the achievement of those targets. So the question is, how is Europe doing with this 20% target? This graph shows the evolution of the share of renewable energy in the final energy consumption of the EU. In 2009, when the directive was adopted, we were at 12, a little bit more than 12%. And now we are at, well, in 2015, we were at 16.2%. So that's 4 percentage points growth in 6 years. So it's less than 1 percentage point, and it's less than the shares of the growth that is supposed for the energy transition that was mentioned before. The red line that you see there is the indicative trajectory that was established in the Renewable Energy Directive when it was adopted. And the blue line is the aggregation of the national plans. So if the deployment of renewables would follow the trajectory that was established in each of the national plans, it would follow that trajectory. So you see that the deployment so far seems to be in line with the 20% target, but we should not claim victory yet, because also you see that in the last 3 or 4 years, the growth expected in renewables is becoming steeper. So a lot of the energy consumption the renewable energy consumption is supposed to come in the last few years. Also, this shows the progress at European level, but if we look per sector, things look different in each of the sectors. So as it was mentioned earlier, in the power sector things are a little easier and progress is quite good. This shows the total generation of electricity versus the electricity generation from renewables in the EU. And you see it's still a relatively small share. In 2005 it was 15% and now we are above 27%. Actually there's figures already for 2015 and we are above 28%. Back in 2005, most of it was hydro, and the growth has come mostly from wind power, solar PV, and biomass, and also a smaller share of biogas in some countries like Germany, for instance. So the power sector is progressing well. Then we also have the heating and cooling sector. Here, back in 2005, we were at 11% share, and now we are at 18%. And there's some growth in biomass, so this green bar says biomass, but there's also some growth of heat provided by heat pumps and solar thermal, but the smaller shares. And the growth here was aided in a way by the decreasing demand in heating and cooling. So. And as we saw before, the transport sector is lagging quite behind. We don't have data for the previous years before 2011 because there were some changes in the accounting rules of biofuels. But anyways, you see that the share as of the latest data is still very low. Most of it is biodiesel and a small fraction of bioethanol and an even small fraction of biogas in some markets. And the progress in different sectors is mixed, but the progress for different member states is also mixed. What you see in this graph is the share of renewables in every member state. So the yellow bar is 2014, the brown one is 2015, and the green one represents the target for each member state. You see first there's a lot of differences in the shares, and that reflects already the starting point that the member state had back in 2009. You see also that there's countries that are ahead of the target, like Sweden. I think I can point to that one. Sweden is already ahead of the target. Estonia is ahead of the target. Denmark. There's also some countries that will not reach the target, and those I will not mention, but you can find them in the graph. And then there's a big group of countries that can reach the target, but they still need to push in the last years, and Germany is among them, or Spain is also. My home country is also it needs to push a bit to reach the target. So that gives you a picture of how energy is consumed today in Europe and the role that renewables have played, and also the transition, so the growth in renewables until now. So the question is, where should Europe be in 2030 with regards to renewables? And that's a debate that is happening as we speak now in the European institutions. So to give you a little bit of background, back in 2014, the heads of state at the European Council agreed on a 27%, at least 27% target for renewables by 2030. So with that strategic target, the European Commission went to work and prepare a legislative package that includes several directives, and so power markets, energy efficiency, etc., and a new renewable energy directive, a proposal for a new renewable directive. That legislative package is now being discussed at the European Parliament, and we don't know what will be the result of the discussions at the European Parliament, but we do know already the draft results from the ITRI committee, so that is in charge of moving this legislative package at the European Parliament. And the draft report considers that it would be appropriate to increase the level of ambition by 2030 to 35%. So you can imagine there's a big difference between 35% and 27%. So 1% of renewables is approximately half of the energy consumption of Spain. So it's a big amount of energy. So why is there's this difference? And one of the reasons why there's this difference in views is that at the time at which the decision was taken at the European Council, things were very different in the markets than they are now. So at that time, solar PV, solar photovoltaics were much more expensive than they are now, and also we didn't know how quick the costs would decrease. The same happened for offshore wind, which accounts for a large chunk of the potential for Europe. That has also decreased costs very steeply. Also, electric vehicles were not so much on the table. And now we know Tesla has done quite some progress technologically. There's a lot of brands that are announcing plans to deploy electric vehicles. So that also transformed the potential in the transport sector, which is lagging behind. So all of those are arguments to increase ambition that the Parliament or the ITRE committee is already discussing. But there's another line of argument, and is that the EU has ratified the Paris Agreement. So it's not only that there's more potential or that that potential is cheaper, but it's also that we need to do it because we have signed the Paris Agreement. And as it was mentioned before, signing the Paris Agreement means that we will need to reduce emissions to net zero by 2060 and almost zero by 2050 already. For the EU has a proposed target for 2030 of 40% reduction. So to achieve that target, one of the key solutions to achieve that target is deploying more renewables. So renewables will play a key role in doing this. Not only to reach the target in 2030, but also to do the deeper decarbonizations that are needed after 2030. So that's the debate about where should Europe be in 2030. And the question is, but where can Europe be in 2030? What are the options to accelerate the transition in renewables? And that is exactly the aim of a study that we are currently finalizing for the EU, in which we look at the realistic potential for deployment of renewables by 2030. We base that in 10 in-depth analysis that we had done already for 10 European countries, the ones that are highlighted in dark blue. And those countries represent 73% of the energy consumption of the EU. So with those countries, we already captured most of the energy consumption. And then the methodology was extended to apply to the rest, to the other 18 member states. So what I'm going to show you now is the main options that come out of that analysis. First, in the power sector, as you would expect, wind is a major player. In this case, it's the largest in terms of contributing to accelerating the transition. In this graph, you see 3 bars. The first bar represents the capacity installed of wind back in 2010, which is the reference year for this study. And the other 2 bars represent different situations in 2030. The first one is what we call the reference case, which is representing what would happen if we don't implement any additional policies, if we keep doing things as we are doing now. And the other column represents IRENA's roadmap for the EU, so the capacity that we have identified that is possible to deploy. So in this case, for wind, both onshore and offshore, we think that the capacity could grow 4 times from 2010 to 2030. And that would mean that that wind power would account for 21% of the whole power generation of the EU. And we think that that is possible because we have seen really impressive cost reductions in wind offshore, but also substantial cost reductions in wind onshore. And also because the technology is improving and machines are becoming much larger, capable of capturing much more renewable resource at in a cost-effective way. So we think that that is possible. The other large contributor in the power sector would be solar photovoltaics. Again, here you have the same type of graph, 2010 and 2030 under a reference case and under the remap case. And in this case, the growth is that we foreseen that is possible is very dramatic. It's 9 times the installed capacity in 2010. Also, there was less installed capacity of PV than wind. But it doesn't seem so impossible if I tell you that already today we are at 100 gigawatts. So it is growing quite quick. And the underlying reasons for that are the same. So PV has reduced the costs really dramatically. So in 2010, so today a PV panel costs 80% less than it would cost back in 2010. And there's still a lot of room for further cost reductions. So generating electricity with solar PV today is already competitive, even in countries like Germany with not so much radiation. And it will be even more competitive in 2030. In the heating sector, we have a portfolio of options that can be used. Solar thermal can be used, for instance, to provide hot water, but also to contribute to space heating in certain buildings, in certain conditions, or to provide low temperature heat for industrial processes. Heat pumps have a larger range of applicability. They can be used for space heating in pretty much every type of building. And heat pumps also are great machines for the integration of renewables because they are very efficient in the use of energy. So you can use electricity to power a heat pump and obtain 4 times the electricity that you put in the heat pump in form of useful heat. And this is because heat pumps are able to capture free renewable heat from the environment, either from the air or from the ground outside of the building. So they introduce renewables because they capture this free heat, but also because you can use renewable electricity to power the heat pumps. The key limitation of heat pumps is they can only produce heat at low temperatures. So they can be used in buildings, or they can be used to provide low temperature heat in industry. But there are a lot of industrial processes that need high temperature heat. And for that, we have biomass. So biomass can be used in industry, but it can also be used in boilers in buildings to provide low temperature heat for space heating or to warm water. And then we move to the transport sector. We saw before that it's a sector that is lagging behind. And electric vehicles are a little bit like heat pumps. They enable the use of electricity where you could only use a fuel before. So in that sense, they are great to integrate renewables. Also, similarly like heat pumps, they are much more efficient than internal combustion engines in using energy. So they save a lot of final energy consumption. An electric vehicle is roughly twice as efficient as an internal combustion engine vehicle. And they can also be useful for integration of renewables because they have batteries. And one of the inconveniences of having solar PV and wind is that they produce energy not necessarily when you want to use that energy. Batteries are helpful because you can store that energy when there's sun and there's wind, and then give it back to the system when there's actual demand for that energy. So the huge amount of batteries that electric vehicles could introduce could help integrate more solar PV and more wind into the grids. The question is, so they are great, but the question is how many electric vehicles will we have in the European roads by 2030? And this is shown in this graph. So what you see in blue is so what we see in this graph is what we think is possible by 2030. The blue bars show the increasing sales of electric vehicles, and the orange bars show the accumulated stock of vehicles. And so what we see is that if the growth trends that we see in the market today would continue, we could be in 2030 at the level of 40 million electric vehicles, which is a lot. But we think it's possible. And that would mean 16% stock replacement. So out of all the vehicles that are already in the road, 16% could be electric vehicles. Now the problem is, the electric vehicles are great, but we still have most of the vehicles that we have in the roads are internal combustion engines. So what do we do in the short term with those? We need an alternative, a renewable alternative to fuel those cars. And the alternative is liquid biofuels. There's two main types of liquid biofuels that can be used: first generation biofuels and second generation biofuels. First generation biofuels are the ones that we are using now, mostly biodiesel and bioethanol, and these are obtained from vegetable oils or from sugars that come from conventional crops like rapeseed, soya, sugarcane, corn, etc. First generation biofuels are quite inexpensive, and the technology is, the conversion technology to produce them is quite mature, but there's limitations in terms of the supply. So there's not an infinite amount of land that we can use for this before we we stumble upon sustainability concerns, or we start having the debate between whether we should grow food or we should grow biofuels. So they have this limitation, and a way to shortcut this limitation is to move towards second generation biofuels. And these can be produced out of waste. So for instance, agricultural waste or wood residues from sustainable forestry management. So these have less supply limitations, but the problem is the technology is not so mature as in the case of first generation biofuels. So they are today more expensive than first generation biofuels, and they are also expected to be more expensive by 2030. But still they could be a sizable fraction of the supply in the transport sector in the EU. So these are the options, the main options, and in this chart, and this is the last chart of the presentation, so just for you to be. This chart is what we call a cost-supply curve. So what this shows is on the horizontal axis, you have amounts of energy, increasing amounts of energy. This represents the renewable energy share in the EU. And the vertical axis represents what we call the substitution cost. The substitution cost is the difference between the cost of the renewable technology and the cost of the alternative conventional technology that could be used in its place. So those blocks that you see here that are below the curve mean that they are cheaper than the conventional technology, and those that are above the curve are more expensive than the conventional technology. So if we start from the left side of the graph, in 2010, Europe was at close to 13% of renewable share. And over this period until 2020, the share will grow until approximately 20%. If we don't do anything, if we keep the system going with the policies that are in place now, then it would evolve according to this arrow, and it would reach approximately 24% of renewable share by 2030. And what comes on the right-hand side of this are the renewable energy options that Irina has identified for the EU. So you have wind power here, solar PV, solar thermal in buildings, heat pumps, electric vehicles, and a lot of forms of biomass and biofuels. So if we would implement all of these options, then the share of renewables in the EU could reach 33%, assuming that the demand follows what we have, the demand assumptions that we have considered. And you see, like 2/3 of those options are cost effective, and the other third is not cost effective. But the overall implementation of these options is saving money in the order of 25 billion per year. So, and that's because the cost effective options are much larger in the weight than the not so cost effective options. So, to conclude, there's an energy transition ongoing in Europe, but it could go faster, as we have seen. We have the technologies there, so we don't need to invent anything in the short term to speed up the transition. And we have to do it because we have signed the Paris Agreement, but we also could do it because it's just cheaper and better than the alternative, and also brings substantial additional benefits in the form of investment, in economic growth, in creation of jobs, and avoided pollution and avoided health damages. So the future for renewables looks good, and here, since we are in a university, I would like to finish with some challenges for the future. So these are things that you could work on soon, maybe together with us, to solve. So these are challenges for the future. How we will, for instance, operate a power system with 50% or 60% variable renewables like solar and wind. That's an open question. How we will use renewables in industry for applications that now do not have a solution or are difficult to implement. What we will do with planes? Will we find a viable solution for aviation or shipping with renewables? How we will store efficiently renewable energy? Or any of the above, what are the renewable technologies that we don't know about now that will become commercial in the future? So those are all questions for you to work on in the future, maybe. And with this, I would like to finalize and thank you for your attention. Yeah.